Well, I mean, that's a really sort of central idea within gender studies and a lot of fields that draw on it. That you know, our gender is always being created, and it's being created through other kind of references to culture, basically. So that we are always learning what does it mean to be a man, or what does it mean to be a woman, or a boy or a girl, and so we're always performing it, right? Living up to a script, essentially. And, you know, of course, people also experience gender as a really deeply rooted personal identity. So sometimes it doesn't really feel like a performance that you put on, right? It just feels very natural. But we can still kind of, I think, look at it as something that we're always, you know, enacting or behaving.
Well, gender, I mean, is created by society, so I mean, your gender identity is how you self-identify within the relations that society creates gender. I think how other people interpret your behavior in their perception of, you know, their personal opinion, or how they were brought up to think of gender can really skew how people are perceived as far as gender identity. I think it really is up to people. I mean, granted, you know, because it is gender expression especially is a social norm, you know, it's normalized by society. It varies from town to town, street to street even.
Well, I think that the minute you start to interrogate things socially or historically, immediately you can sort of see the cracks in the fissure of these natural categories. I think by saying your behavior creates your gender, some people might think that's minimalizing the importance of gender identity and acting as though it's an act rather than performative. And I think that goes into the Judith Butler's notion of the performative. And so performativity is different than performed. And the notion is that these behaviors that get naturalized seem natural. And so people believe that they're sort of born of nature or born of biology. And I think, again, the moment you start looking at history, you can see that that has changed. So that's, I think, a good place to start when you start interrogating gender as something that's constructed.
Well, I think that, you know, I think that a lot of us are much more fluid than we might want to kind of acknowledge, because, you know, if we are always having to perform gender and it doesn't just come from us naturally, then kind of many things about who we are actually much more fuzzy and much less necessarily or inherently gendered than we think, right? So there's a lot of different ways that, you know, it happens, and you see it also in little kids, right? You know, just the kinds of things they like, and the ways that they need to be taught, you know, that they're supposed to like certain things and not like certain other things. So in some ways I think it's kind of, gender fluidity can be thought about as a little bit kind of pre-social, but it also is something that we can all kind of embrace and have a lot of fun with.
I think it has a lot to do with how you're presenting yourself. When I present myself as a professor in front of a class, I'm presenting a different version of myself and, you know, by association my gender, than I would when I'm having dinner with my husband or when I'm on the phone with my sister. And so I think it's the social really creeps into that, and I think it's important to, I think, sort of be honest about that, because it's really easy to say this is who I am, and I think that's important too, because your identity and the way that you sort of deal with self-identification is important, and I'm not trying to take any of that away from somebody, but I think, yeah, absolutely, that gender is fluid.
Some folks are a little bit more, you know, stable. It's not really the best term, but they find a spot, they stick to it. Whereas others are really much more comfortable just letting that expression and identity change.
You know, gender fluidity can be anything from, you know, a straight woman who you know, wears makeup and paints her nails but loves football, right, to you know, someone who's transgender and is really identifying, you know, and making a transition, as well as somebody who's identifying maybe more as genderqueer and sort of really doesn't want to sort of pick, right, a clear gender identity that seems sort of readable to other people.
I would say that different times of day, different periods in your life, depending on who you're interacting with, somebody who identifies maybe as cisgender or somebody else identifies as cisgender, could, I think, easily sort of go in and out of their own gender identity. So I would say that absolutely individuals sort of exhibit that.
It's just like identity in any kind of form. Like who we are today is different than who we were yesterday and who we're going to be tomorrow. Little things and major events in our lives cause us to think differently, to process emotions differently, and I think that gender and sexuality definitely fit within our broader identities. So they are constantly evolving.
So, I definitely, I think that I myself kind of experience a lot of gender fluidity around different things. In some ways, just identifying as gay or lesbian or queer is a kind of form of gender fluidity, because there's some expectation that gender is also heterosexual, it's related to that.
In the gay culture, we have flamers, we have dykes, we have, all sorts of people. So I think it just depends. I mean, it's more open today than it was when I was an undergrad.
I think that little things we can have gradual evolutions and changes in our identity. It can be, today I identify as male, but in 10 years I might not as my gender. But there could be other drastic revelations that just challenge us and kind of break us out of that mold. Folks are raised in a certain household to not question their gender identity, and then all of a sudden they're exposed to something totally new and different, and it can be shattering, and then they restructure based off of that.
Clearly there are people who are not sympathetic to anything but a really rigid structure, and of course we encounter those people all the time. But I would say that I am encouraged by young people on campus. I'm dealing with 18 to 23-year-olds, and I'm encouraged by the way that people treat their classmates. And these ideas are entrenched, and you learn them from when you're growing up, and sometimes people just never question them, especially if you don't have to question them, right? So I think the moment you're asked to question them, it's a challenge, and I've been very happy with the majority of people actually sort of coming to that challenge, especially those who have never been asked the question before, I guess.
In some ways, I think colleges and universities, because so many people are experimenting with who they are, they can be sometimes more welcoming, and I think we can all work to create that kind of space and take the opportunity of being in an educational environment to create the world that we want beyond school.
When I was at the University of Nevada, you never said gay, because back in those days it was cowboys and hippies, and gay just didn't fit in either culture, and you probably would get beat up by the redneck contingent on campus back in those days. If I were a college-age student now, things would be much different. It'd be much easier because everybody just fits in. When I was here on campus, you just didn't talk about it. You just tried to blend in. You tried to be like everybody else, and you did everything that was the norm, what was considered the norm. You didn't do anything that was outside of the box.
The binary says we're all supposed to match, right? Your physical body is supposed to match a certain kind of clothing, is supposed to match a certain kind of way of holding your body, walking around, a certain way of talking, as well as kind of roles like jobs and so forth. So whenever there's some set of mismatches, that person seems to be wearing the wrong clothes, or, I think that person's a guy physically, but, you know, he's acting effeminate, or, you know, a masculine woman, a butch woman. A lot of people tend to get very anxious when they see someone who's not fitting the kind of expectations around masculinity or femininity, or who physically kind of seem to be ambiguous.
I think that some people are free birds. We've always had those. And those are the people that are on the fringe and aren't part of the contiguous part of society. Those people, a lot of people like me, you learn how to fit in and just be yourself, you know, and if somebody finds out, it's no big deal. But because you're yourself. And I think if people get to know you beforehand, before they find out that you are different, it doesn't really make a difference.
I have a really good friend, Brian, who identified as a heterosexual male, but he would wear sarongs on campus and no one would think twice of it, and this was as recent as, like, I want to say like 4 years ago. So it's definitely evolved. I think we've definitely made steps forward, but it's interesting that people still have those perceptions on campus.
Those norms are about power and hierarchy, right? And they can be very, very painful for people, even who you would think are very gender normative or who are straight, you know? I mean, I think that in many ways we sort of forget that, say, straight guys also are constantly having to perform masculinity, right? And, you know, say, you know, if a man comes out as gay, nobody ever thinks he's really straight, you know? They think, okay, he's come out, he's accepted that he's gay and he's being open about it, and yay. But, you know, a guy who's straight constantly has to prove that he's not gay, you know, so he can't, like, be too affectionate with his male friends. He can't, you know, he can't have a moment of enjoying being flamboyant.
I think it's always good to question. I think it's always good to challenge and be critical, because that way it forces us to at least understand why things are a certain way. So even after you question it or challenge it and you still decide, you know, for yourself that that's, you know, the terms that you want to live within, you at least have justification. So I think, you know, broadly that it can apply to gender and sexuality as well, and identity.
And I think one of the things that can be a challenge is if you start to criticize individuals for whatever they decide to be, even if they fall on either end of that sort of binary, the strict binary. If somebody identifies as a really manly man, for lack of a better word, or a very feminine woman, there's nothing explicitly wrong with that identification, right? It's the idea is denying that there is anything in between or outside or other. And I think, by sort of at least bringing the question up to people and by saying things like, I feel different about my gender presentation from moment to moment, I think you can really start a conversation.
It isn't to say that, you know, people should all feel that they all have to be ambiguous or be genderqueer, or, you know, that if you aren't comfortable doing drag that you're a bad person, you know, or you're not an ally or you're not a feminist. I don't think we can kind of reduce it to that, but that there are many ways to challenge those gender norms, and definitely individual kind of actions.
I think we're naturally drawn to finding, we want to be comfortable, and sometimes the way to be comfortable is to determine to do the same things day to day and set a routine. And I think that's part of why we create you know, these gender norms, but I don't think it's necessary. So I just think that it is natural for many people to create them.
I think as human beings, we have a tendency to put labels on things. Even somebody who considers themselves to be, you know, XYZ, alphabet soup, whatever. A label is often a handy way to identify, and I think one of the big things about labeling is that you identify yourself with a certain community. And so I think identity and community are important. So in that sense, I think it's good to have sort of a handy way to deal with what community you're part of. I think having a strict definition is not necessary at all, and I think it's mostly harmful. So
I think that I'm invested in, you know, finding ways for all of us to push those boundaries as much as we can and sort of let the chips fall where they may. You know, if we, you know, can create a totally just world and gender still exists in it, you know, I think there are ways in which gender could be detached from inequality and power and simply be like a kind of style or personal expression or an identity that people have that doesn't have to be wrapped up in power over others. I think, I like to believe that we could, you know, have that.
I think it's from my generation to your generation, it's changed so that, so if you're a man that likes another man and is happy with being around another man, or you're a woman that likes another woman and is happy in being in that situation, that's not what would be the norm from my generation, but it's a perfectly acceptable norm now. And I think it's just people learning that gender, how you express your gender, isn't anything that they should be afraid of. You know, it should be the person, and if the person's happy. I don't think in today's generation we're bucking any gender norms. I think that we're just making the world more aware that those gender norms aren't really the norms. The norm is being who you are and being happy with yourself, and not being frustrated or suicidal, which, you know, in our community is a big issue because people don't know how to deal with it. And I think things have gotten better, and it's because of the more acceptance. I mean, we still have a long, long way to go, but their acceptance is coming slowly but surely.
I think if nothing else, people should be open to the idea of challenging those and accepting that, you know, not everyone's going to be the same, and accept the pushback.